Okay.
Okay, I just hit record so that way I don't forget that. And okay, you both can see it, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so today, I guess before we start, any questions about I know you have a paper coming up next week, and since I have both of you, I'll just check in with that. Any questions?
It's basically applying the readings to something that I guess you've experienced, or
Yeah, it's either something that you've experienced or something that you've seen on TV, like you could do a speech, or if you see like a conversation like on a show like The View or something like that.
okay.
But one thing that's really important is pick one example.
Okay.
Rather than sometimes people do like three different examples to explain the theory, and that doesn't give me the depth that I'm looking for.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Got it.
Yeah, so that will help you. And yeah, always email me if you're still struggling or something. I think it's due on the 18th, so next week.
Yeah, it's coming up.
Yeah, it is. Yannon, are you good on the response paper?
Yes. I'm working on it.
Okay, perfect. I'm also always happy to look at drafts, so if either of you want to send me something, do it before the weekend so I have time to get back to you, but I'm happy to give you advice.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and talk about invitational rhetoric. So today we're going to start by reminding ourselves what invitational rhetoric is. I know this was one of your discussion posts.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll talk about the goal of invitational rhetoric, including what the goal is not. That's almost more important than the actual goal. And finally, we'll talk about those communicative options and external conditions that you answered a little bit in your reading comprehension discussion posts.
Okay.
So that's the plan. Let's go ahead and start by talking about how you defined invitational rhetoric. So either one of you, do you want to tell me, you don't have to do it word for word, but what is invitational rhetoric?
Okay. Other rhetoric is a way to persuade people.
Mm-hmm.
But this one is invitation
Mm-hmm.
to invite others, invite the audience to join the group,
Mm-hmm.
and listening and understanding the reader's meaning, and they start discuss, and the reader will not against them. So the environment is respect and safe. So this can make the results better.
Yeah, it encourages people to want to talk. That's the idea. And I'll add more to that in a second. Elizabeth, do you have anything else to add?
No, I mean, I guess it kind of says that, like, what we normally know as rhetoric, that in a sense, I guess since their ultimate goal is to persuade, they're never really open to any other idea.
Yeah. So Foss and Griffin developed this theory. They started developing it in the 90s, and this is something that is still ongoing. People add to it, but invitational rhetoric, as you both said, is different from this traditional notion of rhetoric where they're asking us to persuade. And they actually created invitational rhetoric as a response to going to different rhetoric conferences or being in rhetoric classes and looking around and realizing that there were no other women, no people of color. And not that it's bad that there are white men who are talking about this, but they were just wondering to themselves, why aren't there other types of people talking about this? And so they felt like by creating this new version of rhetoric, they might be able to get more groups of people on board with the field. So it was a direct response, and they're sort of trying to shape, I guess, the norms and the values of what rhetoric is. So initially, rhetoric was forceful, and you had to talk about, like, this is what I'm trying to get you to do. These women were the ones who twisted it a little bit and said, okay, there's some rhetoric that's like this, but there's other rhetoric that has more to do with talking, that has more to do with reaching things like understanding or just having a conversation. And they found that that could be valuable to study as well. Yeah, so we've sort of already gotten into that idea of, like, the goal is not to persuade. The goal is, according to them, to reach a mutual understanding about some sort of issue. So is this something, have you taken rhetoric classes before? I guess that I should ask you that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this something that sounds familiar to you from other rhetoric classes, or is this something that's a little bit different?
It's a little bit different as just being invitational, but I mean, in rhetoric theory, when I took it, it kind of went through the history of how, like, rhetoric is involved in art and of course politics and almost everything, and it's not always the same.
Yes, yeah. So these women, and not just these women, but there were others, of course, they helped shape us to understand rhetoric in that way. So all of those, like, you probably started your rhetorical theory class with focusing on the Greeks and maybe the Romans, and it had a lot to do with, like, changing people's minds and persuasion. These postmodernist theories, like invitational rhetoric, are the ones that allowed for this to be open-ended. So I'm trying to give you sort of a foundational look at this, because in the 90s when they were writing about this, it was sort of like, whoa, what are they even talking about? This isn't rhetoric. But now it seems like it's naturally just a type of rhetoric.
Okay.
Professor, I have a question. I took many rhetorical course before, and yeah, I know the history, and the professor bring us to explore what is rhetoric and what kind of rhetorical theory is. And but until now, I don't know how to apply the rhetorical to the real life. But I really want to know.
Okay, so this is a good example of a theory that you can do that right away. So what they're trying to do with their theory is they're trying to better understand how you can make changes in society. So if you read some of the examples later on in the text, their invitational rhetoric is a way to get other voices heard. So you can use invitational rhetoric in any situation. Like, I mean, I try to use it in a classroom. Any place where you want to make sure that there are voices that are valued and heard, that's where you can use rhetoric, or invitational rhetoric. So I know that Yanin, you're interested in, like, business, right?
Yeah, I'm interested in business. So I want to use rhetorical to persuade the customers to buy something.
So
yeah, that's my goal.
So for them, they would say that if you were going to use invitational rhetoric, your goal should not be to persuade. So this particular rhetoric is one that maybe you don't want to use because you want to be more forceful. Other types of rhetoric that would probably be more interesting to you are types of rhetoric like probably the modernist rhetoric, like Kenneth Burke, Bitzer, although we don't talk about Bitzer, but you'll see some more of those come up throughout the semester.
Oh, okay. And I think this theory, this rhetorical, we can use in the brainstorm group, right?
Yeah, so this would be really good when you're trying to figure out a decision. It's not something that's good when you're trying to do something quick. Because obviously if you're trying to get everyone's voices heard, it's going to take a long time. And it's also something, so typically in classes I ask, you know, what might not be a place where invitational rhetoric is useful? I mean, when you have to, when, you know, after your brainstorming session, at some point you're going to have to persuade. At some point, someone's going to have to say, my idea is better than your idea. Right.
Yeah.
So I think decision-making processes, it's a little bit harder to have invitational rhetoric. It's easier to have in like the early stages.
Yeah, you're true.
I will say that with invitational rhetoric, the goal can be to persuade, but that can't be the primary goal.
Primary.
So something that's important is like, maybe you are trying to get people to buy your product. You might still try to be invitational because you also care about them. And so your primary goal is to listen to them and, you know, make them feel heard, et cetera, et cetera. And then maybe like a secondary goal is to persuade. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Just as long as it's not the only thing that you're trying to do.
Okay.
Before we get to, so they give us some other examples, but before we move forward, I just want to make sure you got a good understanding of this, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So there are two things I want to make sure that we talk about. So when they try to give you an idea of how this works, they start talking about offering perspectives. This is one of the communicative options that they give to us. So when we talk about offering perspectives, I mean, the easiest way to think about this is allowing people to tell their stories, right? So just sitting around in a classroom and saying, okay, like we're going to talk about healthcare, right, and politics. So everyone in the classroom, why don't you share your personal story about healthcare? Right? That would be just a really superficial way of being invitational. But there are other ways where you could offer perspectives that wouldn't just be like everyone in a class share your idea. Did any of you catch those other ways?
Mm.
I'll give you a second.
Well,
Or even if you don't have, oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, it mentions something about like symbolic choices. So I was kind of trying to understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, so this, unfortunately, the Burke reading isn't up, but this relates a lot to what we were talking about with dramatism, or what you read about. Burke is trying to understand our symbolic choices and the reason why we do this act, or we wear this t-shirt rather than another t-shirt. What they're getting at with those symbolic choices is you could make a choice to wear a certain color or to wear a certain outfit, and that would be a way of making other people in the room feel open and invited and feel like they want to talk.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is also like if you've ever been in a classroom where they have you sit in a circle rather than have you sit in like the normal style. That's a symbolic choice that could become more invitational.
Oh, I see.
Some other ways this happens, so they get into some other ways, like if you have power, for example, and they give an example of someone winning an award. So that person, rather than go up and accept their award and give a speech, they have someone else that they feel like should tell their story instead, go up there and tell their story. Or they tell that person's story for them when they go up and give a speech. So a good example of like politicians doing this is when you hear anytime they reference someone having a personal struggle who they don't really know, but they read about. Right?
Okay.
That's when politicians are trying to be invitational. But in the end, we'll talk about whether we think they can ever actually be invitational. Because that's a whole other controversy. The other way you can offer perspectives is through something called resourcement. Resourcement is doing something unexpected in response to a communication. So, for example, if someone were to yell at you, you tell a joke. All right, so that what's supposed to happen there is it allows for that person, it sort of makes that person enter into invitational rhetoric. So that other person who is yelling at you has to think a little bit about why they were yelling at you and why you responded in a way they didn't expect.
Okay.
So the example they give in the text is some women who were in prison and they were being abused by the prison guards. Instead of reacting to the prison guards by, fighting back or yelling or screaming, the women sat on the ground and started singing. And that made the prison guards stop and be like, whoa, I don't know what we're supposed to do. They don't get into how much they actually listened, but they're trying to tell you that made them at least work a little bit harder, and it could invite people into your perspective.
Okay.
Is that making sense?
Yes.
Okay. So far, like those perspectives that I've given you, does anything like stand out to you that like you don't necessarily think it would be as effective as they're trying to tell you it would be?
Well, I mean, kind of like when you said, like when a politician talks about somebody else's struggle, I personally don't get the same impact when it's not the person that went through the actual experience.
Yeah, yes. And sometimes it seems not. Sometimes it seems like they're telling the story just to persuade you.
Yeah.
And that's something that's important with invitational rhetoric. There has to be, your motives have to be very much not about getting them to change their mind. And I think with politicians, it almost never is that, right? It's always trying to get you to change your mind.
Yeah.
So I think it's very difficult for politicians to be able to do this. Yannin, did you have anything that you feel like, man, this doesn't seem like it could happen?
No, not for now.
Okay, that's all right. Well, I mean, both of you are doing the work of like 25 students, so I'm trying to ask you before I answer on my own. So resourcement, the one that I just talked about, for some people, if somebody responds, like if you're yelling at them and someone responds with a joke, that could be deemed as like passive aggressive, right? So it could be deemed as like they're not taking that other person seriously.
Right.
And then instead of like inviting that other person into your perspective, you actually end up pushing them away. Right? Because they are sort of like, they just get even more mad because you clearly weren't listening to them.
Right.
So that's another one that like, they make all of this sound really beautiful, and I love invitational rhetoric. This is what I try to do in my classes, but we have to really think about how in some contexts, depending on the person, this wouldn't be as effective. Like reaching this understanding with someone who's yelling at you might not be worth your time.
Right.
Those are the things that, in this text, they're not really talking about. They sort of have this really like happy, everything's beautiful type feeling about this, which sounds great. But when you start to get at like, there have been a lot of criticisms of them. And when you start to get at like, okay, we live in a world where people are not equal. So how are you approaching a place where everyone is supposed to be equal in this really happy like environment? That doesn't make sense. So yeah, anyways, that's something that they have to work against all the time. Okay, so to get at this a little bit more, I want to talk about the external conditions. So these are sort of what I've been talking about before. The three external conditions that they get at are safety, imminent value, and freedom. And I believe you had to write reading comprehension questions about this, if I remember correctly.
Yes, I remember.
So when we talk about safety, this one's the easy one, right? So safety is like making sure that when people enter into a space and when they're going to have a conversation, they feel like they will not be attacked.
Yes.
Right.
And they will trust the rhetoric.
Exactly. And this is one of those that I was just talking about can be problematic for people because for some people, there is absolutely no place that they can go to feel safe.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that like, okay, let's throw our hands up, let's forget about it. It just means you need to acknowledge that if you feel safe, that's a little bit of a privilege.
Okay.
Making sense?
Yeah.
Oh, here I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
For this theory of citation, and is the all person or audience and including the writer, they are sitting, or the writer is standing and others are sitting?
So I would say it always depends, but for it to be more invitational, it's probably better if everyone's sitting.
Oh.
Because the idea, like if everyone's sitting, then everyone looks like they're on the same playing field.
Yeah, because I remember there is one way to better to persuade people is the leader standing and the other person sitting, and this is one strategy.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, if you're going to try to persuade me, like if we're getting out of invitational rhetoric and we're thinking about persuasion, I am not persuaded when there's someone who's standing higher than me or someone who's sitting lower than me. That makes me feel really, really uncomfortable. And so what I will do, I will start panicking. I will get out of the situation as soon as possible.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So my feelings on this is similar to why they created this idea of invitational rhetoric. Because they felt that they were sort of being pushed into a certain type of rhetoric. So it's not even just about like buying a car, but they were being pushed into thinking that this is the way that you need to make decisions.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
But I feel this one is not used for the one by one, the face to face. Is used in a group, right? So I think maybe the writer were standing. And others were sitting, and the audience will trust the writer.
I mean, it can happen. I would just say that they would probably prefer everyone to be level. For if someone is standing, it automatically gives us this idea of power, and for them, they don't want that to happen. So I guess the person who would be standing would have to be someone that everyone else in the room trusted a whole lot.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And you don't have to agree with them. So you can say like, all right, what they have to say, I understand it, but this is ridiculous. I don't think it works. That's totally fine. As long as you understand what they're trying to get at. Make sense, Yanin?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we have one external condition, that was safety. The next one is imminent value. Do either of you want to try to tackle what they mean by this?
Honestly, I don't remember.
Okay, that's all right. Like I said, you two are doing work for 25. So, Yana, do you happen to remember?
The value.
Imminent value.
Imminent value. I remember is provides the mutual respect.
Exactly. Yeah. So, what they're trying to say here is anyone who is in the conversation has a valuable perspective. So from the get-go, that's how we look at you, right? And just like we were saying before, I mean, the obvious criticism there is that we can say that everyone has value, but reality, like, I don't know that everyone can actually see it that way.
Probably not.
Yeah. I mean, I would love that they, if they could, but it's really challenging because we already have a society set up in a specific way that sort of has a hierarchy. They're trying to tell you that they're in these sorts of conversations, there's no hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then let's see. So the last external condition is freedom. And this one is an important one, and it gets at that idea of the possibility of persuasion. So here, of course, freedom for one means that you can say whatever you want. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. But on top of that, what's really important here is that you have the freedom to change your mind or to not change your mind. So in other words, if you change your mind, they're telling you that that doesn't make you look bad. They're not going to like tease you if you decided, oh, actually, this is a good idea. But at the same time, if you don't decide that, they're going to say, okay, let's agree to disagree.
Oh.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is to say you have the right to make the decisions.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You have the freedom. And I think for them, traditional rhetoric, this is, remember how I said, like when people are standing trying to persuade me, I feel very panicked.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example of me feeling like I don't have the freedom to make my own decision.
Mm.
So they want there to be less panic. They want you to feel like you can do whatever it is you feel is valuable.
Why is it that if someone's lower than you, you feel the same thing?
Because I also have a problem with power. Like me having power.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Because I guess what happens is like, then I start to think about how I would feel if I was the one who was sitting.
Right.
See,
Okay.
Oh.
I like to overthink things a lot. That's why that's why I teach rhetoric.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
So before I ask you a question to get us thinking about maybe when a politician could use this effectively, any questions about either the definition, the goal of invitational rhetoric, or either of these communicative options?
No, this is to assume that you're never trying to persuade anyone of anything, right?
Yeah, or at least that's not the ultimate goal. So think about it as like, they're okay with saying like, eventually you're gonna have to persuade.
Eventually.
They would put that as like they would put that pretty low, and higher would be like, I want to make sure I understand the perspectives of everyone else in the room.
Okay.
Okay. And for me, I don't have any questions for this theory,
Okay.
but I have the questions for Professor.
Okay.
I have a question. So have you ever used any rhetorical in your real life, like in a friendship, in a work, or yeah?
Yes, I mean, in my opinion, I use rhetoric all the time. I think everyone uses rhetoric all the time.
How you did that?
Yeah. So the reason why I'm saying that is because for me, rhetoric is about interaction, and it's about being engaged, using symbols to be engaged. So something that's like foundational about rhetoric from my perspective is understanding how we agree upon certain types of symbols and how we disagree. So getting back to like someone standing up and me sitting down, some people agree that that's a good way of persuading, right? And in fact, some people who would be sitting down would say that's very effective. But
yes.
I disagree on that. And so for me, the really important part about studying rhetoric as a whole, not just invitational, is to look at all of those disagreements and try to better understand person's perspective. Yannin, does that make sense?
Yes.
Even though I don't think that's what you wanted to hear.
So how to be a rhetorical person?
We all are rhetorical persons because we're all using symbols.
Oh yeah, but how to train it to be better?
So being better is about being conscious about the choices that you're making. So for example, when I decide to wear a purple shirt, right? If I was like an ultimate rhetorician, I would be choosing a purple shirt because I know what the meaning of the color does to my audience.
Oh yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I mean, this boils down to also, sorry, someone's trying to join, but I think it's too late. Oh, okay. Never mind. All right. So Elizabeth had to mute herself, just so you know, Yenin.
Yeah.
So yes. So thinking more about what you're doing is how you become an ultimate rhetorician. I know that's difficult.
Yeah, it's difficult. Like if I use the rhetorical in a certain situation, I must think about the, what my target audience and what's my target context, and I will choose the best one, the best suit for this situation, right? And then I use the way which belong to that theory, and perceive or invite them to discuss, right?
Yeah, and wear something, you know, if you're being invitational, you would wear something that like isn't off-putting. Like in the United States, when you wear red, that's like, for many of us, like, oh my gosh, like that's too much, right?
Yeah.
So you might wear like something like a soft color that would make people feel a little bit more relaxed.
Oh, yes.
Does that make sense? And
yes.
I know, but it becomes complicated because at the same time you have to think about, like, for men and women, wearing those colors is also very different.
Yeah. So we should know more.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, this is why we study rhetoric, because you can think about how people might read your body and you know, what might they read in a positive way and a negative way. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps.
Okay.
I think rhetorical is use the humanity naturally, humanity nature, and further the humanity nature or the influence them, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's accidental, right? But when we're studying rhetoric, we can be more purposeful about it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I love rhetoric.
Me too, obviously. Sometimes I hate it, but that's okay. All right, so the last question I have, and I don't know that Elizabeth will be able to answer this because I know she had to put herself on mute, but can you imagine a place where a politician could use invitational rhetoric effectively, where they wouldn't be trying to persuade you to vote for them?
Like in a public meeting in a building.
Yeah, like that's great, like a town hall or something.
Yeah.
Where and there are a lot of senators and representatives that have to do this. They go there and they have to listen to they're supposed to listen to their voters. So I think that might be a way for it to happen. I also think local government is a way for it to happen because they are less focused on the way the media reads them. I think invitational rhetoric, when the media looks at them, it makes them look weak. But if we're looking at local government and they don't care about the media, then that could actually make them look like they're listening to the people who are in their neighborhood. And I think that could be, in the long run, pretty effective.
Yeah. Well, why it must indoor? Because this theory says the external condition is necessary, right? So indoor can provide the safety environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to provide those external conditions, but if you can find a place to do that, and I think some of these town hall meetings do that, like when they do it at a school or something. I think then it can become effective.
I agree with that.
Okay, good. Well, on that note, if there are no more questions, we can wrap things up. And yeah, you can call it a day.
Okay.
Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. And I know Elizabeth had to mute herself, but I'll say bye to Elizabeth too. All right. Both of you have a good day.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.